Thank you very much to both Janet and Ajay for, I think, really provocative and and very different, but also some interesting correlations between those two presentations. And I'm going to turn it over very quickly to open it up for questions. I just want to say I think that there's interesting scale here. On the one hand, we're talking on the scale of galactic collisions and the sort of the contingency and instabilities. And Ajay, I really appreciate that attention to what I still think of as technologies and how things are sort of constituted and in the practices. And I think then, and Janet's really important research then turns our attention to sort of along the same lines of thinking, but to kind of the micro spaces. And in a tip of the hat to Christina and some of her equally brilliant early work on Hannah Arendt, spaces of appearances, where these sort of things sort of materialize, and where we can really look at kind of in a granular way at what these kind of collisions sort of tell us and what we can learn from them. So I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience, and let me also just take this opportunity to say what a privilege it is to be here. I'm grateful to Christina today for releasing me from the bowels of the bureaucracy to join this brilliant discussion, and also to have been for the past I'd say getting onwards of about 20 years of inspiration for my own research and doctoral work. So let me open it up for questions, and if we don't have any instant questions, I'll turn back to our panelists for some additional thoughts and comments.
Is there any chance of making it from the person of the major minds in Canada? Is there anybody invited?
I turn that back to the audience.
When we were organizing that, we did reach out to Glenn Coulthart, the scholar that I was telling you about before, but he wasn't available. Yeah.
In the same context, I was fascinated by one of your slides. Of course, I was fascinated by the galactic slides too, but the one on the contracts and the bilingual quote-unquote slide. Do you, or did we, as Canada Canadians, when we negotiated with our various First Nations, as they're called now, ever had bilingual contracts, or were they all edited in English only? Because the same interpretation of meaning is now a contested item.
That's probably something that maybe Mario might be able to speak to. The only thing that I would note is that there was recently an Anishinaabe scholar on the Aboriginal television speaking about this very issue, actually, and saying how in terms of reconciliation in Canada, what we need to do specifically is put up the terms of the treaty bilingually and engage in the politics of translation. And she specifically was speaking to how whatever the specific words are that you think might mean land, for example, has relational meaning. So I don't know if it seems unlikely to me that they would have bothered, but do you know Mario? No? Yeah. It would be an important way to think about reconciliation in this context.
On the Indigenous side, the treaties were oral, and so they were spoken ceremonially, and that was considered a sacred agreement that was made. So tradition would not. There was and is no written tradition as a manifestation. The fact that the treaty was spoken, that they were agreed upon, that there was a ceremony to confirm the agreement was agreement enough. In terms of what written tradition we have, we do have the wampum belts, and the carriers of the wampum belts know the stories intimately and can tell you what the agreement was that was made based on the wampum. Not very often is that legally respected, but it is there, and that knowledge is there, and has been passed on these hundreds of years. But just north of here in Kitigan-Zibi, an elder who died a couple years ago was carrier of 3 very important wampums, And I've actually, since he died, I haven't heard to whom and where that knowledge went. But he was carrier of the Jay Treaty, which is the Canada-US over the border agreement that determined that for most Indigenous peoples, the border actually is irrelevant. That is constantly disrespected. Akwesasne peoples can tell you about that constant battle as a daily reality. He was carrier of I just lost it. I can see the picture, but I've lost the name of it. But spoke to the agreements in the territories, what we would call just east of here. And I've forgotten what the third one is. But those stories and those documents exist, but they're not used appropriately.
Lynn Gell also wrote a book recently called The Truth Wampum Tells that kind of goes through and rehistoricizes these agreements from the perspective of wampum. And then there's also the fact that in, like, you know, British Columbia, different parts of the country, there largely weren't treaties, and it didn't stop the government of Canada and British Columbia from basically acting as if they were. So the land dispossession, all these things happened regardless of the fact that there was no treaty, because I think there was no sort of understanding that there was an innate ontological difference about how people were understanding their relationship to the land. But I would want to limit my comments on that because it's not really my area of expertise.
Prior to the Europeans coming to Canada, what was the situation between the different tribes? Did they have problems with each other? Were they fighting for territory? Were they fighting for resources? Did they live a different kind of life?
I mean, it would have been enormously different. Every part, there is lots, like there was international relations between them. There was legal documents. The basis of Canadian federalism is highly indebted to, I don't know if I'll say it right, Haudenosaunee Confederacy. There's huge amounts of politics that wasn't perhaps recognized as politics by the Americans and the Canadians. Again, I could tell you about Sri Lanka, but I can't tell you too much about Turtle Island.
Janet, regarding the World Social Forum, I was tracking your commentary about the change from the Amazon to the then meeting and then what happened in Dakar. And I was wondering, a couple of things, you know, on the one hand, you say, yeah, here you have the World Social Forum, it's the World Social Forum. But at the same time, it resonated what you said about what happened in Dakar to different stories that I heard that happened when the World Social Forum moved from Port Alegre the first time that I think I went to Mumbai. The kind of, that the place where it was happening, it will make a huge difference on the kind of discourse and problematics that will be brought into it. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, 2009 is 2010. 2011 is when it was in Dakar. And we're around the Arab Spring. And
Yes.
so I wonder, you know, to what extent, I mean, and there is a particular tradition also in that region in terms of thinking the problems of difference and political community that has much more resonances with Western, you know, let's say, universalism than with the kind of more universal take that we'll find in the Amazon. So it's just to get a reflection from you in terms of how the local, how the places here enable different
Why don't we take a few questions and then we'll come back?
Yeah, I'm actually very much in line with what,
Marie-Josée.
Marie-Josée, from Yoho. Yeah, my question for you, Janet, was very much because I think your reading, which is very, very useful in many ways, of the Belém event, where indeed there was that very big presence of indigenous people, I thought, is this a fair assessment to talk about the disappearance of that discourse because we are thinking, we're moving into a very different space when we're talking about the African context and Dakar in particular. And I think there is certainly a Eurocentric vision of the world, but there is also a very American content visions of the world that didn't move to Dakar. And even though there were some, key players that have been with the World Social Forum since the beginning that were also in Dakar, but I think there was a different moment and already a split in the visions within the World Social Forum at the time. So I think this disappearance of the indigeneity presence, discourse, and even the environmentalist, and I was not in Dakar, as you know, but I'm wondering what was the type of presence of the discourse? Is it because it was in a different place with different main actors shaping the forum? Or is it because it's been raised as a discourse? Because I think if it was maintained within the same region, let's say, or in a similar context, it might have been very different despite the 2011. So that's the first question I have.
Can I actually take those two? For sure. Yeah. Okay, so a couple of things. One is that, yes, place in the history of the World Social Forum process, place has been extremely significant. And the move to Mumbai in 2004, I think, made visible the particular version of globality that had been constructed in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And certainly the choice of Belém and the Amazon as a site for 2009 enabled the massive indigenous intervention. That's for sure. But in terms of the move to Dakar, what I think was very apparent there is some people travel and some people don't. Some discourses travel and some discourses don't. And it has to do with power, right? And so the indigenous were enabled to be much more audible in Belém because of the place. But they were the ones who introduced this concept of civilizational crisis, which proved to be a very charismatic concept in the context of the financial crisis. And so what happened was that it got appropriated. It got appropriated by the cosmopolitan elites of the forum, those who could travel, those who speak the colonial languages, those who actually move from site to site to site, and those who have the power to impose themselves on the forum. And that's it's a version of cosmopolitan globality on the left, but it's kind of cloaked in the language of pluriversal diversity. And that's sort of it was that kind of dynamic I was trying to get at.
Just following right there, because I'm hearing the answer, out of curiosity, because we have this cosmopolitan elite of the global, the waters that are that can travel and can move this process. But then you have the enormous influence of the locals that I imagine must have been the majority. And how they take it or not.
Okay, so that makes then the particularities of the place very, very important. In Mumbai, you have, so India is very different from Dakar in terms of its capacity to push back against cosmopolitan globality of the Brazilians and the Europeans. And so in Mumbai, you have powerful Indian, social movements rooted in India and a clear sense of their own alternative civilizational histories. In Dakar, number one, the event in Dakar was absolutely chaotic. It was chaotic, and the local force of subalternized movements in Dakar, they were present, but they simply were not audible. They didn't have the power to impose themselves in that sense. Whereas in India, they did. You know, so there are these very different power relations in different parts of the world, and different, different capacities to impose themselves in this kind of cosmopolitan and multicultural space, where subalternized movements, in a certain sense, also have to have the power to speak in the hegemonic languages in order to be heard, you know? So, and it just didn't happen in Dakar. It just didn't. And so this civilizational crisis discourse was appropriated by the cosmopolitan elites and turned into its own thing that made it fit the dominant discourses of the left and just erased the specificity of the Amazonian and Andean content. So that's what I saw happening there. Yeah.
So can I just add something? I come from India, and I'm forever grateful for the British to have actually gone to India. The first thing that they did was to ban setting, the burning of the
Widow emulation.
widow. The second thing was that they gave India the best administrative service in the world. The third thing that they did was to bring English, where 320 different dialects before can now connect with each other through the English language. And so not all colonialists are bad. I think it seems to me that we are painting a very bad picture of colonialism. And I think there is a difference between one colonialist power and another. Maybe the Spaniards were just horrific. Maybe the Belgians were horrific. But I think the British did contribute something to uplift the people generally.
Over to you.
Okay. With respect, I have to disagree with it. I think that all forms of colonialism are awful, and the ones that continue to happen today, and the ones from the 19th century. Like, I mean, I think Gayatri Spivak responds to that much better than I could, where she says, you know, the fact that India has railroads doesn't negate the horrors that went through. There were lots of other ways we could have built railroads. There are lots of other ways that we could have had, I think the term she actually says is the existence of a beautiful child doesn't negate the fact that that child may have come from rape. So the violence of colonization, as it happens in lots of different places, it's part of the colonial revisionist history that reflects the kind of coloniality of the mind, I would say, where many of us, and my grandfather as well in Trinidad, also talked about how things were better when the British were here. I mean, there's a reason why things worked better. Things were more orderly because people were terrified to disobey, because people were disciplined into a particular way of being. It's not to say that there's like one single subsuming awfulness about it, you know, but like the way we create heroes out of people like Winston Churchill for fighting the Nazis, well, Winston Churchill also orchestrated mass famine in Bengal because of his decision that Indian people didn't have the right to eat as much as British people did during the war. When they would take, I mean, I could go on and on forever, but I think we just disagree on that point.
I think there was another question towards the back.
Matt?
Matt?
It doesn't have the same importance as in the face of those kind of issues, but I was wondering, as you were kind of talking about the historical documents, the ways in which the letters to the colonial center have expressed this, we've got this problem. But I was wondering the letters that were coming from the colonial center to the colonizers, so if there you can also see the ontological shifts happening, that the people engaging in the process of negotiation are incorporating and rethinking what their position is because of where they are in the world, versus the people who are sitting in London saying, yes, we need to have this part of the world under our control, start doing it in these ways, and people in that encounter sort of being like, that's no longer possible because we've had an encounter. And I was wondering if you saw those kinds of things happening.
That's a really good question. I think you do over time. In the early years, you don't see it as much. Like in the early 19th century, there's a lot of, I would say, similarity between the governor in Sri Lanka and then the colonial office. But towards the latter part of the 19th century, as this sort of process has kind of become more complex, that's when you kind of see the people who are actually like there having differences of opinion. But then that quickly kind of falls off, I think, by the 20th century, when it really just comes about how do we broker independence now in a legal way. But I think your point is particularly well taken in terms of when things start to go wrong in the colony. You know, so there, I read a really interesting exchange between the Earl Grey, who was the colonial secretary, and I guess a tea drinker, and then his officer in Sri Lanka. And when you read what the sort of governor is sending back to the head office, it's usually like, send money, everybody's going to rebel, it's happening now. And then the people in London are writing back and they're saying, well, you know, looking at the accounts, and I don't really see evidence of the rebellion. So there's kind of like, there's like a global perspective, and then there's the colonial satellite perspective. And the governor always feels like, you know, Rome is about to burn. And I think that actually tells us an awful lot about the sort of like enactment of politics, like in Rancière's kind of conception, the everyday politics that is always happening, even if it doesn't manifest in a full-scale rebellion, the threat of rebellion is always there. You know, Orwell writes about that in Burma when he's talking about how to shoot an elephant, the knowledge that anything could happen. So there was real perpetual fear, and that's why I try to, in talking about the galaxies, I talk about the co-constitution of the modern order. So the worlds actually kind of coalesce in complicated ways. So it's not the domination of one by the other completely, it's a reformulation.
Christina, I think you have a question?
One is to Janet and Amy. There are similar questions. Caught my attention one expression that Janet mentioned about the subalternizing movements, refer to the indigenous and the Dali people. So, thinking about from an ontological perspective, and I know you're criticizing some hegemony, for example, in the case of radical hegemony, that kind of thing. Is there something like subalternized movement that is because they are never subalternized? That is, if we think about the excess that Marisol de la Cadena mentioned, there is always something else that is they do not allow to be subalternized. They are always more than the Western category that we apply today. So that would be, I want to know your opinion about that. And something similar with Ajay, yeah, you also talk about the getting together and then separated, and there is more, not only that, something else than that. When we think about the concept of sovereignty, you also mentioned that sovereignty can really become sovereignty. And how much can we talk about sovereignty at this? How much, because indigenous, some, even in the case of Canada, when you read, I think it's Cornell and Henderson and that said, we can never be sovereign. But for other groups, yeah, you can be, there is an excess in sovereignty. Even if you declare sovereignty, there is something more that you contest. So how can you combine that expression? How can you, what else was there? Why did we allow the British to become sovereign? Even in the middle of the brutality and that, there was resistance and there were ways to do that. People of that.
Would you like to start, or?
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
Please. Okay, so in my work on the World Social Forum and on these forms of kind of modern emancipatory politics, I make a distinction, which is a heuristic distinction between the modern and the subaltern. And the reason I do that is that in politics on the left and in sort of social justice movements more generally, there's this tendency to think we're all, like, we're the 99%. And like we're all in this struggle together. And the distinction that I want to make, especially to and about those movements, is that within those social justice struggles, there are struggles that are fought on the terrain of modern politics by modern subjects, and there are other kinds of struggles that are waged by subalternized subjects. And the distinction that I would make is that the modern political are those, and modern subjects are those that can sort of wage struggles in terms of citizenship, in terms of rights, in terms of entitlements of the modern state and the modern political, and claims to inclusion in those kind of modern political apparatuses. And the subalternized are those who are always virtually excluded from that for all kinds of reasons. And Catherine Walsh, this scholar in Quito, I mean, she pushed me on this, and she said, you shouldn't say subaltern, you should say subalternized, always to point to the fact that people are not born subaltern. Like, it's not an essentialist identity. It's more it's a positioning that they're subalternized by the power, by the modern political. So that's the first thing. But then in terms of talking about the subjectivity, subaltern subjectivities, and their relation to these kind of modern emancipatory movements, I think it's really important to talk about, to recognize, number one, the reality of their material deprivation. Like, there's a real kind of economic marginality and suffering and deprivation of the most extreme kind, number one. And that's really important to keep in view. And that there are struggles. So, for example, in Canada, in the context of Indigenous struggles in Canada, there's a struggle for drinking water. There's a struggle for public health. There's a struggle for child welfare. And these struggles are waged in language often that's about equality, right? It's about the fact that Indigenous communities don't even have the most basic rights that are considered basic egalitarian rights for the Canadian population. And their struggles in those terms, recognizing that extreme material deprivation, that's a product of subalternity. So that's one thing I think is really important to keep in view. The second is the epistemic marginality. So the fact that there are different epistemes and cosmologies and that and knowledges that these epistemic hierarchies are part of their subalternized, of that process of subalternity, and that the languages and the politics of the emancipatory traditions don't even recognize epistemic difference, because they all assume we're all part of that 99%. We're all part of that same kind of struggle for inclusion. And so there's no capacity to recognize epistemic difference and epistemic hierarchy. So having said those two things, then I would also want to say that these subalternized populations also have their own life worlds. And those life worlds are part of the excess that Marisol, I think, is talking about. That these are life worlds and that carry life projects, that these subalternized communities are defending as valuable as places of life and regeneration and alternatives and alternative worldviews and alternatives for the future. And so that they're not just spaces of deprivation, they're also spaces of survival and creativity and regeneration. And that's also part of the subalternized subjectivities and what they bring into this conversation. And that is really, I think, not recognized or valorized by the dominant politics on the left. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And sovereignty. In 2012, when I defended my dissertation proposal, Christina asked me this question as well. What about sovereignty? And I told her then that by the time I was ready to finish, I'd have a new word and a new concept. I don't really, actually. Not yet, but I'm not yet done. I mean, I oftentimes will refer to it as the practice of total territorial rule instead, to try to describe the material practices of what actually is happening, because I agree with you that sovereignty as a concept is so wedded to the kind of like European philosophical relationship that it almost has no meaning in colonialism. But I guess where it has kind of taken on meaning now is in the colonial or in the post-colonial fetishization of sovereignty, you know. So it's kind of like I don't remember the details of the Sidaway article, but when he talks, J.D. Sidaway wrote an article about excessive sovereignty, where a lot of the times the problem in lots of colonized territories is that there's too much of this thing, this stuff of sovereignty. That's why I think I do think that we need to have more than different terms, different practices. So whether it's deterritorialized understandings of political community or something like that, I'm open to lots of different ideas. And I'll keep thinking about the word sovereignty.
Let's take a last few questions. So Joelle and then Mario. Back to you.
So my name is Joelle Morgan, and I come at this research from a very different place because my research is in liberation theologies. So my question is not completely formed yet, but it's about spirituality. And by talking about Theravada, by talking about Mandala, like you start to talk about it in the South Asian context and Buddhism and Hinduism, and like there's the hints of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when talking about Mother Earth and speaking of the Amazon and the forest, and that saving is it's a spiritual praxis that needs to be embodied and that's being called for. And you know, the word sovereignty in Indigenous Canadian context is a spiritual praxis as much as it's a territorial praxis, because those are not separated. That's a Western epistemic binary invention. So I don't know how you see the space for really in this pluriverse approach and way of thinking and understanding, how do we truly embody some kind of a spiritual transformative conceptualization of life and living. And, you know, I don't know, kind of rambling a bit there, but it's where is the spiritual in this? And it's partially one of my internal questions. One of the reasons I chose theology over poli-sci or history or indigenous study or any of these places, I chose theology because theology is one of the only academic disciplines where I can talk about spirituality without people's eyes blazing and you know, not knowing what to do with me. But it's a very marginal field within the academic world because of that. And I think I met with Christina about 3 years ago when I was trying to formulate my project, and one of the things she said to me at the time, and I held on to it, is the spiritual is where we need to go. And I would sort of tentatively say I can hear hints of it in everybody, but nobody's going there.
Why don't we take the remaining questions, then we'll come back to the panel to respond to these. Mario.
Anyway, I'm thinking of the image of the two galaxies encountering now. You have a meshing up there that does not quite capture the different way in which the galaxies encounter. Because it's not straight two-way. British notions of sovereignty did not change because of the encounter with the Ceylon, with the Sri Lankan notions of sovereignty. And so it's important, I think, to look at it, because what creates this situation is a differential visibility, depending where you are standing. For the colonized, the world or the galaxy of the colonized is visible, always, and it needs to be visible because it's the only way that you're going to survive. If you do not recognize it, you are done. That's not exactly the same for the colonized. And that makes also that when there is the situations of equivocation, like when you have treaty, yeah, well, like the case that you showed, where you have the two languages there, it's more likely that you're going to have people being able to read English on the colonized side than the English really caring too much to learn what is written on the other side. It's not really inside, it's kind of superficial. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit on that, on this differential. And then the other element to it is to say, like nowadays, it seems like this colonial notion of sovereignty that's always there, all the game in town. If I understood you properly. Like whenever it's being thought of something different, it's still within that scope. That understanding. And again here, I think that this is something that varies. It's very much a separated kind of thing. But still the memory, I imagine that that's what you are referring to as the pluribus in the past, kind of informing the pluribus in the future. Is it?
It doesn't necessarily need to be memory, but the knowledge that there were other ways. I guess, yeah, memory, that there were other ways that we could organize life. Yeah.
Political
Mm-hmm. I guess. Yeah.
Why don't you take?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Mary Jose.
Yeah, I guess this is mostly a comment that is not well formulated, but I really want to place it on the table. So one of the things you said, Ajay, is about the fetishism of territory, which I think is very, very interesting. And I think it relates very much to your wording about sovereignty. Okay, and in my own research, and I'm bringing that back, I think Janet was really on board when you just mentioned the reality of some of those struggles, because hearing the conversation since this morning, I was like, wow, are we again very romanticizing some of those struggles? And I think that was well mentioned. But working now in rural Oaxaca, where we are dealing with indigenous community fighting for their territory and very often towards mining industries. What I find is that they have a totally different of the territory, but they use the concept of territory. Okay? And exactly what Christina was developing this morning. And yet I believe my understanding and trying to make sense of it is that this territory is actually part of that collision, or, it's not collision, but the fact that they define in their own term but use the concept of territory is to replace the agrarian land struggle and ownership, because there is this very alive memory in those cases. We're not going very far behind, where the land is not something you own, and it's never going to be such. And in their defense of the territory, they're talking about, yes, Mother Earth that is providing life for us, that we need to care for and that we need to respect and that we need to build this relationship. So whoever is coming into this space, it should be a negotiation to make sure that we are living in that same space, but it's not a question of ownership. So that is, at first, a very big challenge of sovereignty and the way that we've been defining territory and borders. Yet at the same time, now they reappropriate the self-determination's vision of indigenous rights
in the Western legal-based system to say that this is our territory and we need to be able to not only be consulted, but decide on what it is that we want to do, how we want to do it, who's going to benefit, for what kind of project, et cetera, et cetera. So here you see this, and I'm trying to use the indigenship that you have been talking about, Christina, because there is that really intrinsic mix of tools and mechanisms that in the daily life of those people, they're trying to put together strategically and very wisely. But I think what I'm trying to deal with is that it's becoming that different story because they had a very different colonial experiences that they can come up with a very different way of talking about the territory. And with a reclaiming of that difference as a resource that is directly challenging the modern territorial or sovereign. Okay, so I think this is fascinating. And then at the same time, what happened in Oaxaca is the comunalidad they're using to talk about the common, and the very different vision of the world and being in the world. And then I have this story from interviews where they're talking about the fact that community can be completely delinked from the territory if your political agenda is not functional in that place base where you are from, or if you have been traveling, migrating to different places for studying or for making a living, but you still carry that communalidad, and this community can be built in different places, not linked anymore to a specific territory. So this, I'm just wondering, how is it that the political ontology is speaking to those different histories or stories?
Okay, we'll turn back to the panelists to try and cover the breadth of last questions, and then we'll wrap up in a few minutes.
I'll start. Yeah, I'll just go in reverse order, I guess. So, yeah, I mean, how is political ontology? I think Mario would actually be in a better position to comment on the specifics of the political ontology, but I definitely, I definitely take your point. Okay, I'll just switch to Mario's for now. I understand why you would say that it would have always been the sort of colonized meeting the British on their terms to learn like English and to learn those ways. But interestingly, in this time period anyway, the time period that I'm looking at from 1815 onwards, most of the sort of desire to acquire the knowledge came from the British side. So the translators were overwhelmingly on the British side, and it's in part because of the specifics of the colony, because the interior was literally cut off for about 300 years based on the sort of internal dynamics of the 400 years of colonial activity on the island from the 1500s. And also, so I think that at least in this early stage, most of the acquisition of knowledge was coming or was sought after by the British trying to get information about the indigenous ways. And in this period, and this kind of relates to some of what you're asking about with religion, this was sort of like the rise in British scholarship on the sort of like Orientalist knowledges of Buddhism and Hinduism in particular. And there really wasn't a lot of knowledge. Like when you read, I was reading like the British Asiatic Journal from 1817 to 1820 to try to see how they were talking about Buddhism. And there's so little understanding. Like they assume it's like Hinduism. They don't really know what Hinduism is. They just call it Brahmanism. So there's not a lot of real knowledge. And in terms of how the world sort of collided and reformulate one another, I would also say that I agree with you that if you don't know, even when the galaxies have collided, if you don't know your world, then you're totally lost. But the worlds continue to exist. Just like when the galaxies collide, it kind of like some solar systems will be destroyed and others will be completely untouched, and others still will be reformulated. And the fact that we today have Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and all these other like strong traditions that have existed for thousands and thousands of years is testimony to the robustness of the persistence of these other worlds. But at the same time, they have been really touched and reformulated, scarred by the colonial encounter, I think. And I would also say that I think it has inflected the development of state formation. It's another chapter of the dissertation is trying to describe how the development of sovereignty actually was more rhizomatic in terms of the British were responding to the politics that was being enacted by the ordinary people, and in terms of like the international scale, I mean, there's some scholars and I argue that that it wasn't really a case of the British having the a model, or the Europeans having a model for what the world state system should look like, and then trying to make it happen. It was more that they developed together. I think Barry Hindas and Anthony Giddens both talk about this, the idea that states developed at the same time as the interstate system. And I think that the global south, at least in South Asia in particular, played quite a role in making that happen. And it's just a question of like nailing out some of the specifics of how they did it. And part of the sort of coloniality of history, the coloniality of archives, is that when you read these archival accounts, archives are sort of seen, I think, broadly as semi-objective collectors of things from the past that we then build histories out of. And that results in a real kind of epistemic violence of representation. When we try and build histories and we kind of interpret, we take it on. I mean, I felt it myself working in London. Sometimes I'd have to come out of the archives and go for a walk just to like get it out of my system, because I started thinking like the people that I was reading about, And it's true that there are other archives, Tamil archives, Sinhalese archives, and that sort of thing, but I don't have the language skills to read them. So, did I answer your question? A little bit? I mean, we can continue there. And then I just wanted to recommend some literature. Actually, the chapter that this is coming out of is actually, originally it was called Religion and Coloniality. And the religion is a huge part of this picture. But one of the things that some scholars in South Asia talk about is sort of like the birth of religion as a modern concept itself. Okay, so you're familiar with that. And just two awesome scholars that I think you would really appreciate. One is George Shani, who writes about post-Western international relations, largely coming from a religious kind of point of view. He's based in Japan at the Christian University in Japan. And the other is the idea of decolonial science as rehabilitation, which comes out of Robbie Shilliam's work that he really lays out clearly in The Black Pacific, which came out, I think, about a year ago. And in that, his whole project of decolonial science is thinking about the deep relations that can be facilitated between colonized peoples and other colonized peoples, sort of without having to stamp passport in London or anything. So just ignoring the colonial metropole and then developing deep relations through art, through spirituality, through reggae in particular. So that's a really wonderful book that I would recommend checking out.
Do you want to answer the territoriality?
Oh, right, yeah, sorry. And could you quickly remind me what the territoriality question was? No?
Well, do you want to
why don't you go for it?
Janet, and then we can come back to
Okay.
Ajay.
Okay, so just on the question of spirituality. Okay, just a couple of reflections, really. One is that I think the modern constitution, that we talked about this morning, is unraveling from multiple directions, or from multiple sources of pressure. And so the earth beings are erupting and protesting. But I think in sort of intellectual movements, I mean, we could talk about environmentalism as kind of a certain kind of the return of nature, the return of the non-human in nature. We can talk about animal studies, which is very big at my university, in terms of the assertion or the concern about non-human species, beings. And And I think we could talk about the religious as another one of those interfaces. Like the indigenous is an interface, so is the religious an interface, where these modes of being in the world and making meaning in the world, which were so suppressed or marginalized by sort of modern science and modern politics, never disappeared. And they are resurging in a big way. And I guess the other thing I would say is that all of these streams can be and have expressions that are actually incorporated into the modern liberal knowledge apparatus. And it seems to me that they have, if they don't engage with the question of coloniality, they're in danger of reproducing that modern knowledge apparatus. So, for example, there are versions of environmentalism that bring the kind of deep ecology critique of anthropomorphism, but do it in a way that skates over how it is a rupturous tradition basically articulated by white men, you know, that glides over it glides over all kinds of other kinds of relations, you know, and so it can become part of a new part of the problem, and a new kind of hegemonic discourse that comes forward in the name of challenging the old, but reproduces its power relations in a certain kind of way, right? The same is true in animal studies. So in my university, just a very recent kind of story about this is that there's a strong animal studies program. The students are, generally speaking, all young white students who have kind of taken on this as their moral crusade, you know, as sort of animal rights as the new ultimate struggle, and that recognizing, you know, the agency of non-human animals, but they don't recognize the ethnocentrism of that formulation. So recently, a year ago, because we're on Haudenosaunee territory in Niagara, and the Haudenosaunee have, of course, treaty rights to hunt. And there's been a deer hunt in the area. And this is negotiated with the Ministry of Natural Resources. And the ministry thinks it's culling the deer. The Haudenosaunee have different ideas about what they're doing. But nevertheless, there's a hunt that happens. Anyway, the hunt has been a site of protest. And so the animal rights protesters, in the name of social justice, have been protesting the Haudenosaunee hunt. Other people who are indigenous rights protesters, also in the name of social justice, are defending the Haudenosaunee right to hunt. So here you have, you know, again, crashing discourses of justice, and also in a certain, you have, in my view, a kind of ethnocentric understanding of animal rights coming into conflict with indigenous practices and not recognizing a different relation to animals and a different understanding of the animal-human territorial relation. And anyway, that hunt last year was this, you know, there's a lot of conflict over it in the university and in the social justice program where I teach. And however, one of the very interesting things that's happened is that there was an event organized after the hunt that basically organized the Haudenosaunee people to talk about their relationship to the deer. And it was the intention there was to actually speak to the animal rights people in terms of another culture's understandings, and disrupting this notion of a universalist human anthropomorphism relative to all non-human animals, which is just simply an ethnocentric projection, right, of modern Eurocentric anthropomorphism. And so there's something shifting there in terms of the interaction between, you know, indigenous peoples, indigenous rights activists, indigenous and non-indigenous, and the animal rights people. And I think that, you know, something similar, we could say something similar about I think liberation theology. I mean, I also have a background in liberation theology, and I think liberation theology is a very powerful example of a kind of an interaction between modern emancipatory political discourses of the left and the Judeo-Christian tradition. that managed a certain kind of interface, but was very poor, for example, in terms of recognizing indigeneity and indigenous sort of understandings of the sacred that really I find not so containable within the Judeo-Christian tradition, but which has not really been well recognized within liberation theology. So it's an example of how you can have a breakthrough in a partial way, but that can still be contained within that kind of modernist episteme. And so it seems to me that unless and until you're also engaging this question of colonial difference, you don't really sort of break with it. So that's just a few thoughts on that.
I think, should we wrap up this panel now to leave time for the next conversation? Thank you so much to Janet and Ajay for terrific presentations and to the discussion that followed. And I'll turn things back over to the floor.
Because of all of your fascinating questions, we've run out of time for the next panel. And so I encourage you all to join them in the reception outside, and we can continue all of these conversations. But first of all, I want to apologize to Judy. I think I enacted my own personal nightmare of someone taking back my PhD. You have your PhD, and I called you a PhD student, so I apologize for that. I was having heart palpitations over here myself. But I want to say thank you, everyone, to your very interesting and insightful comments. Thank you to the audience for your amazing questions. And I think this has been a really wonderful day. And a special thank you to Christina Rojas, our award winner. Who organized this fantastic program and brought us all together. So thank you all very, very much.